During the past month, I've tried to speak to you on the subject of the Gospel of Matthew. And sometime both morning and evening services have been taken from the Gospel of Matthew. And tonight we're going to look at an incident in the 12th chapter, verses 1 through 8. This is an interesting thing because it brings up a conflict sometime that we see between God's commandment and human needs. And the Pharisees and some of the people that opposed Jesus got this all mixed up. And here's an interesting story and Jesus' answer to the things that were transpiring. The 12th chapter of Matthew. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pluck some of the ears of grain and to eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you ever read that what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests are in the temple, desecrate the day, and yet they are innocent? I tell you, one who is greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words meant, 'I desire mercy and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." An interesting thing, I've heard people say in wrestling with this passage that Jesus violated the Sabbath and that he was kind of allowed to do this. No, Jesus did not violate the Sabbath. Instead, Jesus did what was necessary on the Sabbath. Jesus and his disciples were eating the grain, or the disciples anyway, were eating the grain. I posed something at a Sunday school class one time that I've told some of you about. I posed a situation where there was a Christian man who was on his way to worship one Sunday morning, and he was way out in the Tules, and an old dirt road is the only way to get out there. And he was on his way in, and he saw a man who had been injured somehow. He was lying injured on the side of the road, and this man looked at his watch and he said, "If I stop and help him, I can't go to worship." And he was the preacher. And then he says, "I'm commanded to worship." And so he passed the man by and went on to his worship. And he said he felt like he had done the right thing. When his wife heard this, she was appalled that he would say such a thing. Instead of stopping to help the man, relieve his suffering, help him whatever way he could, he had the idea that there was a commandment to worship that was more important than meeting human needs. And this is, to my thinking anyway, this is pretty much what was happening here in the situation of the Pharisees. They were hungry. Hungry is a natural thing that we very well understand, and they were plucking the ears of grain. Now, sometime we set God's laws aside for convenience. I'm too tired today. Look, I need some extra sleep. There's a TV program coming on that I really don't want to miss. And it goes on and on and on about ways that we can set aside the importance of worship or the importance of obeying other of God's commands. Now, when human needs arise, many times we think in terms of that needs to be taken care of. So when a person's, when an individual's children are sick, they stay home and care for the child. When a spouse is sick, the same way. When something happens that is urgent and needs my attention, I do. I may miss worship. I may miss a Bible study. I may miss something like this. And we understand that those things are relatively easy to decide. But let's take a look at the text itself and see what Jesus had to say about this and what the response was. The accusation, by the way, was not that, the accusation was that you have broken the law. They had not broken the law. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 25, he calls attention to the fact that if you're walking along a neighbor's grain field on the Sabbath, you are allowed to pick not on the Sabbath. If you're walking along a grain field, you're allowed to pick some of the grain and thresh it and eat it. And that was perfectly all right. You could not put any in your pocket, and you couldn't get a sickle, and cut a bunch of it. That was wrong. That was unlawful. And then it also said that if you're walking alongside his vineyard, you can pick as many grapes as you can eat. But you can't put any in your satchel. And so Jesus was not violating a law so far as stealing is concerned or something like that. But he was violating instead a tradition which had grown up. The tradition was that on the Sabbath day you could not pluck more grain, more ears of grain than you could put into a sheep's mouth. Now you needed to have a great big sheep to measure that, I guess, but that was one of the traditions that had grown up, and so this is basically what they were upset about. Was because, wait a minute now, you're plucking the ears of grain, that's okay. But wait a minute, you're threshing them. And then you're blowing the chaff away, you're winnowing. And so these were three violations that they saw, that they could have seen, of what the disciples were doing. Now, notice what Jesus answered this with. When David was fleeing from Saul, he came to the tabernacle. The Bible refers to this as the temple because that's what they referred to it at that time. You remember that Samuel's mother and father went to the temple in Shiloh. Well, that really was the tabernacle. The temple wasn't built until a couple of hundred years after that, or about 150 years after that. So the tabernacle, as you walk into the tabernacle, on the right-hand side, there was a table. And this was referred to as the table of consecrated bread or the table of showbread. It stayed there, 12 loaves of bread, or, not like we buy in the bakery today, but 12 loaves of bread. And then every Sabbath day, the priest would go in, and the priests were the ones who ate this bread. Nobody else was supposed to eat the bread. But Jesus said, do you remember the story of David? He and his colleagues went in and they ate the showbread, which they were not supposed to do. And yet they did it in innocence. What was the criterion? The criterion that Jesus was using was, here was a human need that had to be fulfilled. God didn't make the Sabbath day so that we would have to conform under all circumstances. He made the Sabbath day as a day of rest. He made the Sabbath day as a holy day. But there are times when human needs, such as illness that we spoke of a moment ago, there are times when human needs surpass that. Don't get so wrapped up in the ritual of observing the Sabbath that you lose sight of the purpose of the Sabbath. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But the seventh day, he says, is a Sabbath. The word Sabbath, Sabbaton, literally meant seventh. But because it was a day of rest, it came to have a symbolic meaning of the word rest. And so that was the idea of it. While I was preparing this lesson, I ran across something that I had not read before. In the book of Jubilee, which was written somewhere probably around 150 to 200 BC. It was a book written by Jews surveying some of the Old Testament and putting it into a contemporary context for people to benefit from that. But it also had some things about the book of Leviticus and the law of Moses. Now, this was what was interesting to me, because in the book of Jubilees, on the Sabbath day, they said, you are not supposed to work, not supposed to do any kind of work. And as a matter of fact, said you can't even plan future work. You cannot contemplate work in the future on the Sabbath day. You can't even think about work. Well, otherwise, they said, this is a violation of the Sabbath law. The reason I'm bringing that up is that Jesus did not see the commandments of God in such a form, legal expression. Instead, what he saw was Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was to be a benefit to mankind. And that was the whole thing that he was talking about when he said this. So what was the attitude that some of these people had toward the Sabbath day and toward this legalism? One of the most interesting statements, brief statements in the Bible that has always caught my attention was at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus gave the story of the wise man and the foolish man. One built his house on the rock and the other built his house on the sand. And he talks about the rains coming and the floods coming and beat upon that house and it fell. And then he used the expression, and great was the fall thereof. Now, he leaves and goes down the hill. The people who were there, they go down the hill and they're talking about it. I guess preachers always like people to talk about their sermons, provided they're saying the right things. Okay, they're coming down. What were they talking about? What did they say? Here it is. When Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Why? Because he taught them as one having authority and not as their teachers of the law. I remember reading this. I remember reading commentaries on it many years ago. And most of the commentators that I read, they were saying, well, Jesus had authority from God to teach. And that's the authority that we're talking about. Folks, that ain't it. That isn't it. What he's talking about here is what communicators have come to call ethical proof. Ethical proof meant that you can believe what this speaker is saying because he lives it every day. That's ethical proof. And it carries more weight than just what he says. And so they saw in Jesus a man who was practicing the very things that he was talking about. But on the other hand, the 23rd chapter of Matthew, Jesus said, the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. That was the seat of teaching. The Pharisees sit on Moses' seat and teach you the law. He says, these things do, but don't do after their work, because they say and do not do. They say and don't do. That's one of the big problems that we have in churches today and families today. We know what to do. We talk about what to do. We can't tell people what to do, but we ourselves are not living so that they see in us the kind of thing that we're talking about. And so the eyes listen better than the ears listen. Edgar Guest wrote this: I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather one should walk with me than merely tell the way. The eye's a better pupil, more willing than the ear. Fine counsel is confusing, but example is always clear. I always thought, and then of course that's only the first part of his little, of his poem that I think he entitled "Sermons That We See." But the idea is that no matter what we're teaching, no matter what we believe, no matter what we are advocating, if we are not living that way, it doesn't amount to anything. People don't see it. And this was the problem with the Pharisees. Now, right after this event took place, Jesus went in the 9th verse of chapter 12. Jesus went from the place where he was, and he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you have a sheep that fell into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And so you see, human needs sometimes surpass some of the things that God has commanded us to do. It's so important that we see God's laws in a practical context. God, when he gave his laws to us, both Old Testament and New Testament, he gave them to us for our good. He gave them to us to make life happier and better and more productive for us. It was not the idea of just, well, I think I'll put a law against this. I think I'll put a law against that. And so many times Christian people and non-Christian people alike see the laws of God as prohibitive or demanding, rather than seeing them as adjuncts to our lives, things that will help us to become not only better people, but happier people. Well, Jesus said, by the way, in the 9th chapter of Matthew, Jesus told the disciples when they condemned people for the disciples for eating this grain and so forth. Jesus said, "If you had known what it meant, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you wouldn't have condemned these guiltless people." Well, what does it mean, or what did it mean, I desire mercy and not sacrifice? This comes from the 6th chapter of Hosea. It's a very, very interesting statement. Let's just talk about Hosea for just a moment as we close. The book of Hosea, as a matter of fact, the book of Amos and the book of Hosea together, they are both very, very fine and interesting books. Both of these books deal with the idea that ritual had become so important to the Hebrew people that ritual was it. And so they became, as J.P. Sanders said, they became very immoral, but at the same time very religious. Very immoral, but very religious. Well, we think that these are contradictory terms. No, people sometimes live a very religious life, but they're cheats, they're thieves, they're immoral. And so this is the thing that Hosea and Amos were both speaking against. Amos begins his book by comparing Israel to a whole lot of the nations around them. And Israel is kind of getting puffed up, it seems, when all of these comparisons are made. And then finally he comes down and he actually says, Israel, you're in the same boat. Hosea does the same thing, only from a different perspective. Hosea married a woman who was named Gomer. And she was very unfaithful. She was a prostitute, and very unfaithful to him. But he loved her, and he kept bringing her back. And so from this, Hosea draws some wonderful lessons. And he shows how these people were very astute, even though they worshipped idols. They were very astute in their caring for the sacrifices and the temple and all this sort of thing. They were very, very particular about that. But at the same time, they were people who were living tremendously immoral lives. Let me read to you from a portion of the 6th chapter there of the book of Hosea. After he had said all of these things, the Israelites are saying, oh, maybe we better go back to God. And so here's what Hosea says in reference to that. Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us into pieces, but he would heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. Let me pause right here for just a moment. Sometime, God is the handiest thing we can find in the closet. When things are bad, we can turn to God. When things go wrong, we can turn to God. But after we get that straightened out, then we turn back away and go the way we want to. And so that's the picture that Hosea is giving of God is giving through Hosea of these problems. Let's return to the Lord. He's torn us to pieces. He's going to heal us. He has injured us. He will bind up our wound. After 2 days, he will revive us, and on the 3rd day, he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. Let us acknowledge the Lord. Let us press on to acknowledge him. As surely as the sun rises, he will appear, and he will come. He will come to us like the winter rains and like the spring rains that water the earth. Now, that's what the Israelites how they were going to respond. Now, here's what Hosea says. God says, "What can I do with you, Ephraim? What can I do with you, Judah? Your love is like a morning mist. It's like the early dew that soon disappears." You see, I make New Year's resolutions on New Year's Day. But then something happens on January the 2nd that I have to set these things aside, and my New Year's resolutions kind of go down the drain, you know. So he says, "What can I do with you, Ephraim? What can I do with you, Judah? Your goodness is like the dew that disappears. Therefore, I cut you in pieces with my prophets. I killed you with the words of my mouth. My judgments flashed like lightning upon you. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings." What does he mean by all this? He means, folks, being a follower of Christ, being a follower of God for these people was not something that you do part-time on the Sabbath day, or when you go to the temple, or when you offer a sacrifice. He says it's a whole lot better for you to learn mercy, for you to learn what it is to serve people, for you to learn how important it is for you to be God's person all the time in the way you live, rather than just when you come to worship, or when you come to sacrifice, or when you come to give your tithe, as the Israelites did. And the whole idea is that they simply didn't understand that. And so Jesus said, you know, when you condemn these disciples of mine for eating this grain, you fail to see the importance of human needs and God's commandments. You haven't learned that mercy, goodness, these are the things that people see in us. This is the kind of life we ought to be living, not just a life of ritual, not just a life of requiring sacrifices, but a life that goes to the very depths of your being. That's the idea. So when he says, what can I do with you? God can't do anything with us when we're that way. We have to come to him on his terms, and we have to serve him on his terms, and then he brings all kinds of blessings for us. So following this, Jesus went into the synagogue, and he was asked, is it okay to do good things on the Sabbath? And after that, this whole thing I read to you a moment ago, after that there's a terrible statement. The statement is that the Pharisees then sought how they may kill him. Isn't that a sad statement? After Jesus had healed people, after Jesus had shown them what Scripture meant, they were so entrenched in their ideas that they said, we've got to get rid of this fellow. This does not say that Christ set aside God's commandments. It does say that Christ had the wisdom to see the importance of fulfilling human needs, even if it means sometimes that we do have to miss worship, or we can't obey this commandment at the same time take care of what's needed. There's a hitch in this, and that hitch is that he did not say that this depends on what you just want to do. He didn't say, yes, but it's okay if you'd rather watch TV than to obey me. It's okay if you would rather do this or that instead of obeying me. That's not the idea. The idea is, let's learn to be servants of other people. And when we learn to be servants of other people, we will be able to meet the needs of people in a much more effective way and spread the light of Christ in a much more effective way.